Chapter 22, The Civil War. Fort Sumter. Soon after his inauguration, President Lincoln learned that supplies for federal troops at Fort Sumter, which was in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, were running out. Sending more supplies could provoke war. After alerting the CSA, Lincoln sent unarmed supply ships. In response, on April 12, 1861, the Confederacy attacked Fort Sumter. The fort surrendered 2 days later. The Civil War had begun. Border states. Lincoln called on state militias to supply troops for what he estimated would be 3 months of fighting. In response, border states North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Arkansas seceded. They refused to bear arms against their fellow Southerners and saw Lincoln's actions as unjust. Border states where slavery was legal, but not such a big part of the economy, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, stayed in the Union. In 1863, the part of Virginia loyal to the Union, West Virginia, became the U.S.'s 35th state. North versus South. The North, the Yankees, or the Union, who wore blue uniforms, had a bigger population, more transport options, especially railroads, more factories and production capacity, and more money. The South, the rebels, or the Confederates, who wore gray uniforms, had influence on the world's cotton market. The South needed to fight a defensive war. They hoped for foreign intervention and planned to hold out until the North got weary of the war. The North needed to fight a more active war and subdue the rebels. Both armies consisted mostly of inexperienced volunteers who signed up for only 90 days of fighting. Together, North and South faced the scary reality of a war that pitted countrymen against one another. The First Battle of Bull Run. In July 1861, the Union Army tried to take Richmond, Virginia, which had become the CSA capital. The Confederate troops met the Union Army at Manassas, Virginia, which was a key railroad junction near Bull Run Creek. Neither side was ready. On July 21st, the Union forces crossed the creek and pushed back all of the rebels except for a unit led by General Thomas Jackson, who received the nickname Stonewall for refusing to move. Under Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate Army pushed the Union troops back to Washington, D.C. The First Battle of Bull Run showed both sides that this war was going to be more dangerous and difficult than expected. George McClellan and Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln brought in George McClellan to lead the Union Army of the Potomac. McClellan trained his troops for almost a year, but, convinced that Confederate troops were too powerful, hesitated to attack. Meanwhile, the Union forces in the West, led by Ulysses S. Grant, were taking forts, gaining ground, and seizing control over trade and supply routes. Admiral David Farragut led Navy troops to take New Orleans, wrapping his wooden ships in heavy chains to protect them like ironclads. New military technology. One of the most significant new inventions of the Civil War was the ironclad warship, a ship that was armored with iron. With other major inventions were the repeating rifle, which could fire more than one bullet before it had to be reloaded, and the mini-ball bullet. Soldiers could shoot farther and more accurately. War became a whole lot deadlier. The big battles. The Battle of Shiloh. The Confederacy's western troops retreated to Corinth, Mississippi. Grant's army followed closely behind, stopping near Shiloh Church in Tennessee to wait for reinforcements. On April 6, 1862, Albert Sidney Johnston, leader of the Confederacy's western troops, and his soldiers ambushed Grant's camp. Over 2 days, the Union forces were able to push the Confederates back into Mississippi, but both sides lost huge numbers of soldiers in the Battle of Shiloh. The Peninsula Campaign. Because Lincoln was frustrated with McClellan's hesitations, McClellan finally announced a plan to move the entire army by boat from Alexandria, Virginia, to Virginia's lower peninsula, a huge and slow operation. But Confederate troops were able to retreat into Richmond faster than the Union Army could cut them off at either Yorktown or West Point. The city had time to prepare. 3 months into the campaign, when Union forces reached Richmond, the Confederates, under the command of a new leader, Robert E. Lee, pushed them back in a major defeat, ending July 1st, 1862. The Second Battle of Bull Run. In August 1862, in the Second Battle of Bull Run, the rebels gained another victory. Antietam. Lee decided to attack the North. A victory there would take the war to northern soil. It was also designed to help Virginia farmers harvest their crops by moving the battle north. In September 1862, the Confederate Army crossed the Potomac into Frederick, Maryland, a Union state. Lee planned to divide his army into 3 units, which made him vulnerable to attack. A Union soldier found a copy of Lee's marching orders in an abandoned rebel camp. When McClellan learned of the plan, he was slow to act when he could have used the secret information to get an advantage. 2 days later, on September 17th, the two armies met near Sharpsburg, Maryland, at the Battle of Antietam, which became the deadliest one-day battle in all U.S. history. After Lee retreated, McClellan didn't follow with an attack. Lincoln fired McClellan. The Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln said that the Civil War wasn't being fought to end slavery, but to preserve the Union. He knew that he had to keep the border states under Union control. He was also determined to keep Britain out of the war. The South was hoping that Britain, desperate for Southern cotton, would officially enter the war on the Confederate side. Lincoln had a plan for how to keep the border states in and Britain out, but he needed a clear victory before presenting his new policy. In September, after the win at Antietam, Lincoln announced that on January 1st, 1863, an Emancipation Proclamation order would go into effect. This is a military order would free all enslaved people in any area that was in rebellion and would go into effect unless those rebelling states gave up the fight before that date. Lincoln timed the proclamation with the victory so that it was seen as an act of strength coming from a victorious army. He did not have the constitutional power to end slavery, but he did, as commander-in-chief, have the power to confiscate property that aided the enemy. In this case, he used the Southerners' insistence that enslaved people were property against them and declared that all enslaved people in rebelling states would be free, men and women. This accomplished both of his goals. It kept the institution of slavery intact in the border states, while signaling to abolitionists in Britain that the aim of the war was shifting toward emancipation. These abolitionists, who had successfully petitioned to end British enslaving systems in 1833, pressured the British government to stay out of the Civil War. Lincoln and the Union Army had no way to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, but word spread across the South, and the tide of people walking off plantations seeking both freedom and the opportunity to join the Union side increased dramatically. Black men ready to fight. The Emancipation Proclamation also cleared the way for black troops to serve in the Union Army. From the start of the war, abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, had argued that black soldiers could help the North win as well as prove their worth and earn full citizenship. Lincoln resisted, afraid of how the border states would react. But many black men and women did not wait to be freed. Freedom was theirs if they crossed Union lines. Union camps soon filled with contraband. As early as July 1862, black people in New Orleans, Kansas, Missouri, and South Carolina began to form unofficial military units. They were officially brought into the Army in January 1863. The most famous of the black units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. This group of more than 1,000 volunteers came from Canada, the Caribbean, and all parts of the U.S. About 180,000 black men were enrolled in 175 United States Colored Troops, USCT, regiments by the end of the Civil War. This constituted 10% of the entire Union Army. The home front. Because so many men were away fighting, women in the North and South took on more responsibility in farming, business, and manufacturing. Women also supported the war effort as nurses. Battlefield nurse Clara Barton later founded the American Red Cross. High demand for supplies bolstered the Northern economy. Food shortages and inflation damaged the Southern economy and hurt Southern morale. Both the Union and Confederate governments imposed an income tax and issued new currency. In the North, this money was called greenback money. The need for soldiers led to the institution of a draft on both sides. Because rich men could buy their way out of it, riots ensued in New York City, and more than 100 people died in July 1863 draft riots. Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. After firing McClellan, Lincoln put Ambrose Burnside in charge. The rebels and General Lee forced the Union into retreat in December 1862, Battle of Fredericksburg. It was one of the worst defeats of the Union Army, who lost more than 12,500 soldiers. Burnside resigned. General Joseph Hooker took his place. In May 1863, Hooker led the Union Army in an attack on Chancellorsville, but once again, Lee's army forced them to retreat. It was considered Lee's greatest victory. Hooker was replaced by George Meade. Stonewall Jackson died from battle wounds during the attack. The Battle of Gettysburg. Lee took another chance on invading the North. In June 1863, Lee's army entered Pennsylvania in search for supplies in the town of Gettysburg, unaware that the Union cavalry was there as well. It was an accidental encounter that blew up into the most famous battle of the Civil War. Timeline: July 1st. After the rebels pushed the outnumbered Union forces back into the town, the Union troops regrouped on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, strategic positions on high ground. Both sides called for reinforcements. July 2nd. Lee ordered the Confederate Army to gain the high ground on the hills Big Round Top and Little Round Top, but the Union held on to these positions after heavy fighting. July 3rd. When the Union line appeared to be weakened, Lee ordered General George Pickett to attack the center of the Union line. In Pickett's charge, the Confederates marched directly into heavy Union fire. July 4th. Lee and his army began to retreat to Virginia. The Battle of Gettysburg was a major victory for the Yankees and a turning point in the Civil War. Pickett's charge became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy because victory would never again be so close for the Confederates. Gettysburg is also famous as the site of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. On November 19, 1863, during the dedication of a soldiers' cemetery there, Lincoln gave a 2-minute-long speech on the importance of the Union cause. The first line of the Gettysburg Address: 'Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent,' is a clue to the year in which it was delivered. A score is 20, so 'fourscore and 7 is 4 times 20 plus 7, 87 years. 1863 minus 87, 1776. Vicksburg, Mississippi also fell to the Union on July 4th, 1863, which meant that the North controlled the entire Mississippi River. The Virginia Campaign. After all the disappointing Union commanders, in early 1864, Lincoln put Ulysses S. Grant in charge of all military operations so the Union armies could act as one. Grant decided that the war would be an attack on Southern morale and resources. That is, the Union would practice total war. Total war that also uses attacks civilians and military resources. In the Battle of the Wilderness, on May 5th and 6th, 1864, Grant, knowing that his army was larger than Lee's, pushed into Virginia despite heavy losses. From June 9th, 1864 to March 25th, 1865, Lee was forced to defend Richmond and was vastly outnumbered in the siege of Petersburg. Grant broke through the Confederates' line and forced Lee to abandon his fortifications. Lee's army had dwindled down to just 27,000 men compared to Grant's force of 120,000 men. Sherman in the Deep South. In September 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched with Union forces to Atlanta and destroyed the city. He continued his march to the sea, capturing the city of Savannah, then moving north to the Carolinas. In this terrifying campaign, Sherman's army destroyed plantations and burned fields. He wanted to destroy the economy and morale of the South. He did, and he stirred up long-lasting resentment. The election of 1864. Until mid-1864, Lincoln had been in a bad position for re-election. After victories in Gettysburg and in the South in the summer and the fall of 1864, he won in a landslide against George McClellan. It was seen as a command for emancipation. On January 31st, 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, banning slavery in the United States, except when used as punishment for someone who is convicted of a crime. It was quickly ratified by the states. The end of the war. On April 2nd, 1865, the government of the CSA fled, burning the city of Richmond behind them so that it wouldn't be of any use to the Union Army. Lee reluctantly decided he had no choice but to surrender. On April 9th, 1865, Lee and Grant met at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant offered the following terms of surrender. The Confederate soldiers would be fed and allowed to return home with their property and horses. Lee accepted. The last of the Confederate armies surrendered on May 26th. The Civil War was over with a victory for the Union, and now it was time to rebuild the country.